Welcome to the book of Leviticus. Today we will take a look at some of the ancient codes of Israel's laws. First, a word about resources. We've been going through a lot of lessons and talking about when they were written and trying to figure out how they fit into a timeline. So I thought I would share with you these sources that are used in the studies of Old Testament scripture. We have them marked with initials. So occasionally in a video or in a reading, you may come across one of these initials, J, E, D, or P. And you may wonder what they stand for. I know that in some of the videos we've watched in the last few lessons that the term P has come up a few times. So think of them as being on a timeline. That is a timeline starting with the furthest out date from zero. In other words, before the current era. So 950 years before the current era. The writings are often attributed to a southern kingdom called Judah, which is the southern part of what was ancient Israel. And so they are often referred to with a J because they're Judah or Yahwist or Jehovah spelled with a J. And so that'll help you remember that those are the furthest or oldest writings. Next, we have the E, which is the Elohist writings, which are attributed to the northern part of Israel, to what was called the Northern Kingdom. And you can see they are 850 BCE and on, with descending numbers getting closer to zero on the timeline. So they are a little more current than 950. So we go from 950 to 850. And then we have D or Deuteronomic writings attributed also to the Northern Kingdom beginning in about 750 BCE. And then the most current, or should we say the newest of the writings of the Old Testament attributed to P or priestly tradition. We have much more evidence for the priestly tradition than we have for others. And so it begins in the 500s BCE, which is really the time following the release from the Babylonian exile. So I hope that helps you understand a little bit about how old the sources are in writing that we have access to. And this is a painting, a piece of artwork showing the prophet Ezra. The scribe, he's a scribe and a prophet, so he's copying the book of the laws of Moses. And it is said that he copied them from memory. And that's a traditional saying, around 458 before current era. Ezra was a key figure following the Babylonian exile in establishing the Jewish people as a religious people of the holy book rather than as a holy nation with a king. So the tradition of the writings becomes more important to hold the kingdom together because there is no longer a physical king in Israel after this time. The book of Leviticus is probably the most controversial book in the Old Testament. The many laws that are in there are sometimes hard to understand. Sometimes we don't know if they apply to modern times, just to ancient times. Were they real or not? Were they really carried out? So we're going to take a look at the book of Leviticus and divide it into three sections. The first is the priestly material that is to do with the jobs, the description of the um, materials and requirements to become a priest. And those are through chapters 1 through 16. The second is the Holiness Code, which is chapters 17 through 26. The Holiness Code is for the people, and that sounds kind of like something that's difficult to accomplish, but we'll find out that there are ways to accomplish it, and that it has really had meaning for the people of Israel in ancient times and in current times. And the third part is an appendix. It's like an add-on at the end of the book, the last chapter. And it talks about taking vows in the temple or tabernacle and about making tithes. So those are three divisions of Leviticus we'll be looking through. Leviticus really continues the book of Exodus. It was copied and read widely by the scribes in the years following the Babylonian exile, which was 587 BCE. The Levitical priests were responsible for the stewardship of Israel's identity as a separate and a people that are holy and set aside for God. So Leviticus, because of its many laws regarding worship and offerings and regarding how to treat people within their community, is what is holding these people together as they are in exile, to show what they have in common, so they don't forget who they are as a people, because they have this common identity of being a holy people who are set aside for worship of Yahweh. So the last verse in Exodus rolls right over into Leviticus in the first verse. And it says, "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle." So those are the last words in Exodus 40. Leviticus chapter 1, the first words are, "The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, and he said, 'Speak to the Israelites and say to them.'" And then we can say what he said to them is the rest of the book of Leviticus. From Exodus chapter 19 through all of Leviticus, and then on through the 10th chapter of the book of Numbers, Israel is receiving law while they are camped at Mount Sinai. This time is used to teach the people how important it is to be the people of God and are set aside in holiness. This book is a lengthy narrative of a set of rituals and legal requirements that the Lord dictated to Moses as soon as the glory of the Lord descended into the tent of meeting. So apparently, God had not said enough to Moses on the mountain, so their conversation continues now in the temple, or excuse me, in the tabernacle. So it's an intense period of divine instruction, and it's during the journey from Egypt to the promised land. Leviticus is in the center of the Pentateuch, the 5 books of the Pentateuch. It's central to the transition from Egypt to Canaan. Israel views the law as a divine gift from God and as the center of Pentateuchal teachings. So on the left is a depiction of Moses reading the law to the people. On the right is probably around the time 608 to 600 BCE, a priest reading the Torah, reading from the scroll of the Torah to the people of Israel. It was commonly done. So holiness and divine law is a theme. the two themes that run through the book of Leviticus are that the divine law is a gift from God to be treasured, and that the Lord is holy and chooses to be in the presence with his people. Therefore, the people must also choose to be holy. Leviticus functions as a priestly handbook containing laws that regulated worship, ethical conduct, purity, and the community at large, so the community as a whole. The priests themselves were called to a higher accountability and responsibility as they were the leaders of the community. The sins of the priests could bring guilt upon the people, but the sins of the people were only upon themselves. It says this in Leviticus, the 4th chapter. The laws are sometimes presented in a story fashion in a hypothetical situation, such as for unintentional sins. In Leviticus 4, verses 23 to 26, it describes this, and because they're presented in a hypothetical situation, you would be able to insert your own personal narrative into the story and then seek out the appropriate justice or atonement. Keeping the law exactly without fault does not make you holy, but participating in the law sets you aside as sharing in God's holiness. That's hard to understand, so here's an example of how you might think about it. An example from music. If we were to sing and play music, we are not the music itself, but we participate in the music by the acts of playing instruments or singing or dancing and so on. So we can experience the music and become part of it in that way. And so it is with the law of God. You would experience it, you would participate in it, you would be participating in the laws that are God's set for you, and through the participation, you become holy. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You must be careful to keep all of my decrees and regulations by putting them into practice. I am the Lord. We will see these words repeated frequently. So, holiness in personal conduct. Leviticus 19, the Lord also said to Moses, "Give the following instructions to the entire community of Israel. You must be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy." In Leviticus, we come to understand that sin is the rupturing of relationships. Sin disturbs the relationships between a person and their God, or between two or more people, so between people in the community. Guilt and debt are the biblical words that are used to describe these disturbances. The laws in Leviticus are written to give a tangible means of retribution and to restore relationships between humans and God and person to person. The concept of atonement is both theological and ethical. People cannot mend their relationships with God if they do not mend their relationship with their neighbor. And Jesus teaches this in Matthew 6 when he's teaching the disciples how to pray in what we commonly know as the Lord's Prayer. And in verse 12, he says, to forgive your trespasses as you forgive those who trespass against you. The ritual purity laws. The sin, I'm sorry, start again. The laws were an important social identity marker. The uniqueness of these laws bound the community together. The laws were signs of lives that were devoted to God. These laws were not about hygiene as much as they are about being a community who is set apart for God. Some items, such as utensils that are used in the tabernacle or temple, had to be routinely purified. Food and personal purity were symbols of cleansing or separating yourself to be holy. The laws in chapter 18 and 19 are some of the most controversial laws in the whole Bible. The concept of sexuality in the Bible is based on the command given by God to be fruitful and multiply. In addition, all the laws are given to foster order and trustworthiness within the community. Israel was very much aware of the cultures around them and their worship and sexual practices. Remember, they want to remain separate and holy, so therefore, some of the worship and sexual practices that were practiced in other cultures around them were very objectionable to them. Leviticus views sexuality quite differently than modern Western people do. In the Western world, sexuality is viewed through the lens of individualism. Every person is free to act in their own interest as long as it does not violate the freedom of anyone else. So we must now think of with ancient eyes. In ancient Israel, sexuality was viewed through the lens of a community's survival. Each person owed their life and actions to the community, especially to one's own household, often made up of more than one generation and extended family groups. Committing acts of unlawful sexual activity would create disturbance in the family, the basic unit of community. Israel understood God was committed to fostering conditions in which all life could thrive. The laws were God's way of creating order in a chaotic world and bringing justice to the community and world at large. Therefore, the laws are seen as a great gift from God. Leviticus 18. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. I am the Lord your God. So do not act like the people in Egypt where you used to live, or like the people of Canaan where I am taking you. You must not imitate their way of life. You must obey all of my regulations and be careful to obey my decrees, for I am the Lord your God. If you obey my decrees and my regulations, you will find life through them. I am the Lord." So the parameters of these laws are there to make you have a prosperous life, to have peace and not have chaos. So the laws regarding sexuality, as far as marriage and adultery and so on, they are there to keep peace within the household. And you can easily understand why that would be necessary within a community as closely knit as Israel was and living so close within multiple family units. Violating another person's marriage or sexuality is going to bring nothing but problems. And so there were many laws to try and stop people from interacting inappropriately. We switch to something a little more cheerful here. The sabbatical year and the years of Jubilee. in chapter 25, Leviticus this chapter goes completely against our modern concept of capitalism or a free market economy. The ancient economy was very different than the systems that rule our modern economy, particularly here in the Western world. You may wonder if Israel actually followed the sabbatical economy, and they most likely did, because there's evidence that this was a practice throughout Mesopotamia, not just with Israel, where it is recorded as the Misharam and the Duraru laws. Misharam means justice, and Duraru means new laws brought in by conquering people. And so people throughout Mesopotamia did practice this. It's recorded in the laws of other cultures and in the Code of Hammurabi. And celebrations. Passover, when we get into the book of Numbers next week, we'll have an event where the second Passover is celebrated while the people are still at Mount Sinai. So this year, 2024, Passover will be on April 22nd through 29th. So it's an 8-day festival that commemorates the Jewish exodus from slavery in Egypt. During this time, they remove all shemetz, which is leavened bread, from the house, and they only eat unleavened items to commemorate the urgency with which the former slaves fled Egypt, which it did not allow enough time for their bread dough to rise. During our Passover Seder meals, the story of the Exodus is retold. Yom Kippur, or Day of Atonement. This is the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. This year, it will be in October, from the 11th through the 12th, starting on a Friday evening and going through Saturday. The day focuses on atonement and repentance. Typically, a person fasts and refrains from physical pleasure and from work. Sounding the shofar, which is a musical horn, brings Yom Kippur to a close.
A lot of people regret getting solar. After having been fortunate enough to help over 8,000.
Hello, and welcome back for another Torah Tuesday. We are still in Leviticus, and we're working our way through the book, paying attention to the units of this giant literary sandwich or chiasm that organizes the whole book. Today we're in Leviticus chapter 16, which is the Day of Atonement ritual. It has 18 speeches on either side of it that are framing it, as well as 3 distinct sets of mirrors on either side of it that draw our attention to the center. As we read about this ritual, it's important to notice that there are both similarities and differences with the other sacrificial rituals. As you read the chapter, you'll notice there are burnt offerings and sin offerings. There's blood being sprinkled. These are all things we've seen before in Leviticus, but there are a number of new elements here that are not found anywhere else. First of all, the priest is wearing different clothing. The high priest is not wearing his elaborate regalia with gemstones and gold threads and gold chains. He's wearing his simple white linen tunic with a sash and his regular headdress. There is bathing involved in this ritual. He bathes himself before he dresses in his clothes, and then he goes into the tabernacle after the ceremony's all over and takes off the white tunic and gives himself a bath and puts on his regular clothes. So there's a specific role for clothing in this ritual. Another difference is the timing. This is not something that happens over and over. This happens only once a year at the high point of Israel's liturgical calendar. He brings incense with him into the tabernacle. This is also new. And the priest goes all the way in, not just into the holy place, but into the most holy place, not once, but twice during this ritual. And there's one other element that is very unique, and that is the presence of a scapegoat. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Leviticus 16 begins and ends with a narrative frame that connects this ritual with the tragedy of Leviticus chapter 10. Remember when Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, went into the holy place with unauthorized fire and incense? They're not supposed to be going in. They are violating God's commands and kind of choosing their own way of worship, and they both drop dead. In chapter 16, we read, "The Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron who died when they approached the Lord." So we're explicitly supposed to be thinking about that death as we read about the ritual. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell your brother Aaron that he is not to come whenever he chooses into the most holy place, behind the curtain, in front of the atonement cover on the ark, or else he will die. For I will appear in the cloud over the atonement cover." So these verses situate this story as a response to and a solution to the problem with Nadab and Abihu in chapter 10. This is an effort to make sure that this never happens again. The chapter ends with a brief statement that says, "And it was done, as the Lord commanded Moses." So this reassures us that this ritual is not just a timeless set of instructions, but that it's something that happened, that Aaron actually did and Moses oversaw, and it solved the problem, or it begins to solve the problem that was introduced by the rebellion of Aaron's sons in chapter 10. Now, I mentioned the presence of a scapegoat in this ritual. Instead of just one goat being offered as a sacrifice for the sins of the people, there are two goats that are brought and presented to the Lord. One of them is slaughtered, and the blood is brought into the most holy place. The other one has a unique role. Aaron puts his hands on the head of this goat and confesses all the sins of the Israelites from the whole previous year. And then he sends the goat out into the wilderness as a visual reminder that the sins are being borne away by this goat, that they're being taken far away from the tabernacle. So this event is a spiritual spring cleaning of the tabernacle, or a sort of reset button that allows for a fresh start. All year long, people have been bringing sacrifices to the tabernacle. They've been laying their hands on the heads of the animals, and they've been confessing their sins. And the result of that action has been to dump their sins at the tabernacle, and they go away forgiven, which is great news. But after a whole year of that, the tabernacle has this invisible accumulation of sin. And the Day of Atonement ritual is the one day in which the tabernacle itself is cleansed. I mentioned that Aaron goes into the most holy place twice. First, he goes after he sacrifices a bull that takes care of his own personal sin and the sins of the priests. And then he goes in after he sacrificed the first goat, and he brings the blood of that goat. So first for the priests and then for the people, Aaron enters the most holy place, the very presence of God. I mentioned that he burns incense this time. The incense has a very important function of creating a cloud of smoke that veils him from the presence of God so that he doesn't die. And ironically, it's his son's offering of incense that was inappropriate the first time, but this is the right kind of incense offered by the right person on the right day of the year, and it is pleasing to God. The New Testament book of Hebrews announces that Jesus is our great high priest. Jesus did not enter the earthly tabernacle, but the heavenly one. He did not enter with the blood of animals, but with his own blood. Not year after year, but once and for all. Jesus is the reason we no longer have to offer sacrifices. But what he did on the cross, and what he continues to do for us by interceding for us, is patterned after the instructions of the book of Leviticus. So without the book of Leviticus, we can scarcely understand who Jesus is or what he came to do. I hope this has shown you how important it is and how fruitful it can be for us to carefully read the instructions in Leviticus. Even though we're not carrying them out, they help us understand who we are, what God expects, and what he's accomplished for us in Christ. Have a great week.
All right. I hope that that helps you understand a little bit more of Leviticus. I know that the laws are very complex in some cases and seem very harsh in others, but we will have to keep on our ancient eyes and know that through time, as with all cultures, Eastern cultures, Eastern world cultures have made advancements, and that we don't have the same ideas about things today as people did a long time ago. Even in our own Western world, we look at things differently as we evolve into what we call modern times. All right, I just brought some ideas for discussion here. I was reading about Herod's wife, who was the wife of Herod's brother, actually. And Herod had to divorce his current wife in order to marry his brother's wife, who was also divorced. So they each divorced a partner in order to marry each other. This is what John the Baptist was calling out as Herod's great sin. And that was what caused his death by beheading. So if we look back in Leviticus, we can see many of the laws that we're talking about intermarriage or about marrying relatives, that this was what Herod had and his wife had both done, was to commit a sin by marrying another person than the person that they had originally been betrothed to, by making a choice of it. Neither one of them was widowed or widower. So it was a choice, and so therefore it was a choice to sin. And you can go back to Leviticus, I think it's in chapter 20, where this is written about the relatives being within a household unable to marry each other. Then I also was thinking about the birth of John the Baptist, and it brought two things to mind. If you remember the story of the birth of John the Baptist, that Elizabeth and her husband was a priest, a high priest, I believe, and that Elizabeth was barren, just like Sarah, and was in her old age. And her husband, the priest, did not believe the message that he received while he was in the tabernacle, Holy of Holies, that his wife would become pregnant. So he was struck unable to speak until after the birth of the child, whom they named John and became later known as John the Baptist. Not quite so dramatically in the book of 1 Samuel is Hannah. Hannah is an older woman whose fellow wives, she was one of several wives, had not been able to bear children. So that reminds me of Rachel, when we read about Jacob and Rachel, and how Rachel was unable to bear children while Leah was bearing many children. And so Hannah was praying specifically to be having a child. She promised her child that if she was conceived and if she did bear a child, that she would bring the child to the temple and dedicate him. So this goes back to the last chapters of Leviticus. I think it's chapter 27, where they talk about vows. And Hannah made a vow and had dedicated Samuel to the temple. And in each case, both John and Samuel were dedicated as vows to serve God. There are different types of vows. Some can be for a lifetime. Most of them were for 30 days or a shorter period, some period of time, or for a specific thing. You could dedicate even besides your children, you could dedicate yourself to a certain vow, or you could dedicate your property to be used for a certain thing, and so on. But I thought it was interesting about Elizabeth being like Sarah and Hannah, also um, having a child in older age or with difficulty, like Rachel. This is what it says about Herodias, the wife of Herod. Herodias left her first husband to enter into a relationship with her uncle. So it was not just that she divorced or left. She was also marrying her uncle then, Herod Antipas. For the marriage of Herodotus and Antipas to take place, 2 divorces were needed. Herodias herself left her first husband, and Antipas broke his marriage with a princess in order for them to marry each other. And that was their sin. Plus, it was her uncle or his niece that he was marrying. This is a beautiful piece of artwork that I came across that I thought I'd share. It's a fresco, if you know what a fresco is. It's like a sculpture on a flat wall. It's like a relief or a raised relief figure and painted then. So it's the consecration of the tabernacle. So it's someone depicting how they visualized the consecration of the tabernacle. And this is found in a synagogue in Syria. Interestingly enough, as I was reading through and looking through different things this week, I came across a lot of things that have been preserved from early Christianity in the country of Syria. So for next week, I had a difficult time deciding what it was I was going to ask you to read. Numbers is 36 chapters long. There's some things that are repetitive or continuing from what we've been doing with law codes. And then there are some little stories here and there sprinkled throughout. And so it's kind of like there's no natural dividing place for this book to break it into teaching lessons. So my suggestion is that we just take 36 and divide it by 3, and maybe we'll do it in 3 lessons. And so about 12 chapters a week. The first section does kind of break off at the end of chapter 13. So read what you can, do the best you can, and we'll talk a lot about what we've read in class next week. So this first section that we'll read continues the law codes and actions of the old generation that came up out of Egypt initially, and it brings them into accountability for their rebellious nature, because they frequently will rise up against Aaron and Moses. All right, so I will see you back next week. Here's my closing. We've been talking a lot about laws, the whole book of Leviticus, in fact. So this came up on my reading this week, and so I thought it was quite suitable. So verse of the day, one day this week was, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another, Jesus says in John 13, verse 34. And the prayer for this day then is, our God, who is love, give us your compassion, that we might have compassion on others. And it reminds me very much of the Lord's Prayer. And just so you get a giggle to set you off for the rest of the week. enjoy Facebook, but I say use it sparingly. Have a good week, and I will see you next time when we start the book of Numbers.